KZSU-FM Stanford, welcome to another edition of Hearsay Culture. My name is Dave Levine. I'm a professor at Elon University School of Law, as well as an affiliate scholar at the Center for Internet and Society at Stanford Law School. This year, also affiliated with the University of Milan's Information Society Law Center and the University of North Carolina's Center for Information Technology and Public Life. Hearsay Culture has been covering social media and Facebook for years. In my own personal work, I have been a regular commentator and, let's say, critic of the lack of transparency in social media companies and how they do business. I put all of that aside, in a sense, in interviewing Jeff Horwitz, Wall Street Journal reporter and author of the 2023 book, Broken Code: Inside Facebook and the Fight to Expose Its Harmful Secrets. I put it aside because I put on the hat here of a fellow journalist, having done over 300 interviews in this space. And today we are going to talk with Jeff about the incredibly copious research that he did, including, of course, his connection to and revelation of troves of information shared by Facebook whistleblower Frances Haugen. And in the process, we're going to talk about where social media is today and where we might be headed, being that we are recording on July 19th, 2024. The book Broken Code does what Kremlinologists did during the era of the Soviet Union in trying to trace what is a rather Byzantine and complex group of teams operating inside of Facebook that sometimes we're working in tandem, often we're working against each other's odds with limited information. Again, I was reminded of a variety of books on Kremlinology and the building of the lack of building of the Soviet internet, and on down the line as I read through Jeff's chronological reporting on how Facebook reached the point where it did in 2021, 2022 with the whistleblowing, and of course the book having been published in 2023, where it was headed. This is hard work, both for the reporter and also for the reader to follow, and yet it is a story that has to be followed in order to understand how Facebook became what it was, where the problems lied, and everywhere from misinformation to advertising, but perhaps most importantly today, why we have the social media environment that we do. While X and Instagram and a variety of other platforms exist, the bottom line is Facebook really did set the standard, and I think continues to set the standard for how we think about social media as an information resource, as a global powerhouse, but also how we think about institutions today. And so Jeff's reporting is incredibly complex and fantastic, and we're going to be talking about how that's been done. Jeff is a reporter for the Wall Street Journal. He has covered the technology sector for years. His work on this book, which the predecessor were known as the Facebook Files, won the George Polk Award for Business Reporting and the Gerald Loeb Award for Beat Reporting. He was an investigative reporter for the Associated Press, lives in San Francisco, is joining us on Hearsay Culture today via Zoom. Jeff, thank you so much for joining us today on Hearsay Culture.
Certainly. Glad to.
So, Jeff, I'm going to start off on an exceptionally serious note, being that we are, again, recording on July 19, 2024. This show is going to air tomorrow, July 20th. Of course, it's been reported in the last 24 hours that your colleague, Evan Gershkovich, was convicted on charges of espionage in a Russian court in what is clearly a sham trial, sentenced to 16 years in a Russian prison colony for the allegation. And of course, the evidence is murky or non-existent, but that he was charged with collecting secret information about a Russian tank factory on orders by the Central Intelligence Agency. These are the allegations from the Russian government. I want to get your immediate reaction to this conviction and your perspective as an experienced Wall Street Journal reporter.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the quality of the evidence against him, I think it's not murky, it's non-existent. This is very clearly, as the journal has stated, these are false allegations, and Evan was arrested initially for doing his job, and being basically being a good reporter. Obviously, 16 years in a penal colony is devastating to hear about, and I think the journal said that it's going to continue to push for his release, and I look, as a reporter, I will say I've been glad to see how active the paper has been in pushing that. That's my only sort of personal thought. Otherwise, this is, I guess, just a recognition that of how hard and courageous reporting can be for many people overseas. Evan obviously has, like, you can just see him behind the plexiglass showing tremendous courage. I think we're sort of all inspired by him, even though this is obviously, just hellish.
We that plexiglass to which you refer, anyone who's observed Russia over the years has seen before. I mean, leading critics like Alexei Navalny has been seen behind those glass. Other less well-known Russian critics of the current Putin regime have been seen there. As a reporter, what are your reactions, not only in seeing your colleague in that situation, but also, as you alluded to, and the fact that not only the courage, but the ability and willingness to put yourself at risk. The Wall Street Journal is obviously a paper with as many resources as any paper would have, obviously has influence outside its boundaries. And yet here he is. And perhaps that's part of why was chosen. But can you talk a little bit more about your reflections on how the journal's been handling these issues, and as a reporter, what it makes you think about going forward as a journalist?
I mean, I think, look, like being in this profession, and being primarily in the US, I've only done a little bit of overseas work. It was a brief period of my career. Uh, it is a reminder of how lucky we are that even in the current conditions, we are as safe to do our work as we are in the US. Plenty of people in Mexico have lost their lives for this occupation. And Evan isn't even the only reporter who is being held in Russia. So, I mean, there's plenty of the only, I would say, foreign Western reporter who's being held in Russia. There's plenty of others there too. Um, I think the journal has been, I think, really aggressive about this. It was, very heartening to see the resources and advocacy. I mean, if you go to the journal's homepage, not just today, but any day, you'll see Evan's always there. So I think the effort here is to wait for whatever diplomatic resolution there is and push for it. And I don't think anyone's got any criticisms inside the paper in terms of how heavily we've been pushing this, and we simply look forward to getting our colleague back.
Uh, I wouldn't be doing my job as an interviewing journalist if I didn't recall from my listeners. Of course, we've seen reporters, executed by ISIS. I'm thinking, of course, of James Foley, other reporters over decades, and war correspondents going back hundreds of years. And here we are in 2024 with a brutal regime treating reporters like this. As you point out, in the United States and in other countries, there is still something called freedom of the press, albeit one that is under pressure. And of course, we have politicians, particularly on the right, who threaten reporters publicly. However, we have that press. As consumers of journalism, what do you say to those people who value the press in terms of how we society can support the work that you do, even if we don't always agree with the reporting or think it's biased or all the things that go into doing the job?
Look, it's a very messy business. I think that particularly in the social media age, that the urge to sort of fight over this stuff, and sort of make fairly incendiary accusations about reporters and their motives, publications and their motives can be pretty intense. I do think that it's worth remembering that this is not a line of work that you tend to get into because you're trying to get rich, and that uh, I think, look, most of us, I do believe, go about trying to do every day what Evan was doing every day, which is doing sort of good work and bringing out information under difficult circumstances. And um, I don't know that everyone needs to always say a prayer for journalists before going to bed and thank them from the bottom of their heart and at all times of day, but like um, this is obviously work that everyone needs. And I think in terms of Russia, we are all the poorer for not having Evan out here.
Yep. I appreciate that perspective. I'm a little freer as an interviewer and not a full-time journalist to say perhaps a little more bluntly, and I'm going to say it to my listeners, which for me it starts with paying for good journalism, supporting journalists not just through the marketplace of ideas but through subscriptions. I had the opportunity to visit the Wall Street Journal's offices earlier this year. Not for listeners, not anything to do with this interview with Jeff, but I asked for, and I'm just holding it up for listeners, but I asked for the I Stand with Evan material, and those little things I think carry, at least within the United States, to help us remember the privilege we have, but much more importantly, to support to the extent it is possible imprisoned journalists like Evan. So on that note, though, turning towards your book, and again, we're chatting with Wall Street Journal reporter Jeff Horwitz, author of the book Broken Code Inside Facebook and the Fight to Expose Its Harmful Secrets. I want to dive into the detailed reporting that you did, but appropriate segue here is to talk briefly initially about, of course, the and I'm gonna use a really silly way to describe it, but the star of the story, even perhaps to those who are not as familiar, which is not, by the way, Mark Zuckerberg in terms of the story, but of course whistleblower Frances Haugen, who I'm certainly not the same level of risk, obviously, as one who's reporting in Russia did, but who did put herself at professional and perhaps personal risk in putting information out there. And so I want to start our discussion by talking a little bit about Haugen and your perspective working with a whistleblower. Whistleblowers, have get a lot of attention. Probably the most famous reporter, and I'm putting it in big quotes, reporter, or at least he calls himself that, on whistleblowers, is Julian Assange, who I personally do not think is a reporter, but certainly has been involved with whistleblowers. But you, as a reporter working with a whistleblower like Frances Haugen, how do you approach that kind of relationship? You talk in the last third of the book about Haugen. I mean, you allude to Haugen, but then you come back to your work with Haugen in the last third of the book. But help my listeners understand how a reporter works with someone like that, who approaches, right, with 25,000 plus, right, documents and burner phones and screenshots of information and all the kinds of information that you got.
Well, she didn't approach with that.
Okay. Okay.
That
Fair
wasn't
enough.
sort of,
Fair enough. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, no, it was, look, I think sourcing relationships are fundamentally, they are relationships. They're about understanding what another person is trying to accomplish, and sort of where you know things can be productively done that exceed the capabilities of either party on their own. And Sorry, give me one moment. I just realized I'm getting apologies. I'm getting notified via, there we are.
You want me to? I'll pause.
Okay, yeah. Well, she didn't approach with all of that in hand. I think that sourcing relationships are fundamentally relationships. They are about two people figuring out how to work on something together and how to do something that is more productive than either one could manage on their own. And yeah, I think Frances truly is an extraordinary person, and she was an extraordinary source. One of the things that uh, it's not like the material, the area, subject matters that she ended up providing information on and gathering documents on. It's not like those were sort of things that were like wholly mysterious as they were, going to be of interest. Like I knew there was something in those areas. But the problem is that the process of being a whistleblower is extremely difficult on a personal level. I mean, you have to, you're first of all, you're taking risks. Second of all, you're going against what a lot of colleagues would think is the appropriate course of action. There's just a whole bunch of social, financial, potentially legal implications. And I think a lot of people at Facebook, they only really thought about talking to reporters after they'd already left the company, burnt out and disillusioned. Francis, and this is just, I can't stress how unusual this is, saw that path pretty clearly. And, even before sort of even before she quite knew exactly what it was going to look like, was, basically came to me. I mean, I reached out to her, and then she got back to me a month later and said, "Hey, I'm interested in talking." And what she made very clear is that she believed that Facebook was a clear threat to both uh, societal infrastructure and human life, and that there was a ton of information behind its walls that the outside world needed to understand how it was shaping society, and that if she didn't come forward, she believed that she was going to have blood on her hands, which is a fairly aggressive way of thinking about a whistleblower's responsibility, but obviously one that I was delighted to. I was delighted that that was her read, and I think in terms of the risk she took, yeah, it always seemed like a long shot that she was going to go to jail for anything like this. I mean, it's one thing to take things from government and be a whistleblower under those circumstances. It's another thing to do it from a tech company for a public good reason, not like trade secrets. But that's not my place to say. And I mean, I think this was tremendously scary on just a human level to do, even after she decided that this is something she was going to do, regardless of the consequences for her. It's not like that's something you stop thinking about.
Right. How do you, respecting how the relationship developed, how do you vet someone like this? Because people have a variety of motivations for doing something like this. Obviously you have to, which I want to talk about, you have to fact check, which of course is challenging. It is remarkable that there's references to having been granted the ability to interview people at Facebook in the midst of all of this. But one would assume that that there has to be some degree of skepticism when someone comes forward like this. And as a reporter, what do you do with that?
Yeah, I mean, look, uh, there's always, if I hadn't gotten in touch with her, I think I would have been first. I would have been much more weirded out by someone basically saying, "Hey, like, I want to be the inside source, and I will continue working there, and sort of as I work, be in constant communication with you." Which, again, that wasn't the initial offer, but it pretty quickly turned into that sort of being the direction we were going. Um, I think that it's a few things. First, the fact that I reached out to her first, I don't think anyone's good enough to, like, I have a hard time coming up with any conspiracy theory that would where that would be I would be getting played. Second of all, though, at this point, by this time, I'd spent enough time with Facebook documents. There was no question that, you know, what, you know, she had available was real. And yeah, and that she was an employee and all of that. So in terms of motivations, I mean, I think, look, as I said, it was great to have somebody who, um, you know, was stating, look, I'm doing this because I believe in the dangers and harms uh, that this platform poses, and I wish to show you why I believe that, citing documents, right? That's like ideal. Because in the end, Wall Francis is a really insightful person, and I think understands, you know, certainly understood more than I did about the internal operations of Facebook. She also understood that, you know, her word on it wasn't going to do, and that, you know, sort of what mattered was documentation.
Are you still in touch with her?
Yeah, yeah, no, we're still in touch. Not, I mean, we don't like hang out every week or catch up every Sunday night, but we talk, and you know, I still think very highly of her, and you know, consider her to be a fairly amazing human being.
As you you know, and I'm not asking you to reveal personal conversations, but to the extent that you're willing, I mean, given where we are today, which I want to talk about, what does she have opinions, or I'm sure she does, reflections on the result of all of this work, which we're going to talk about, and where we find ourselves today?
I wouldn't want to speak for her and sort of what she would say the overall, you know, outcome of all of this has been. I will say that I think one of the reasons why she ended up going public, which was not the original plan, was her sense uh, that just having the information out there might be not be enough, and her concern that, you know, governments and regulators might not act. And I think there have been some places where, uh, I will say there's been a lot of hat and very little cattle, in terms of the US, on regulatory approaches to date. Not saying that that couldn't change, but you know, there have been at this point two rounds of people, you know, sort of high-ranking legislators on a bipartisan basis agreeing that absolutely, you know, legislation was imminent and they were going to take care of this, and it hasn't happened yet. So you know, I think, look, like, this is a thing that I struggle with as a reporter too, is that obviously, you know, like, I'm not an activist, but you do hope that the information you're providing is compelling enough that it does help change the world in its own way. And I think, you know, uh, there's perhaps more that's happened in Europe, but I think there's a recognition that this is perhaps a bit of a slow burn.
We're chatting with Wall Street Journal reporter Jeff Horwitz, author of the book Broken Code: Inside Facebook and the Fight to Expose Its Harmful Secrets, on KZSU-FM, Stanford, and Hearsay Culture, which KZSU is a nonprofit, non-commercial radio station at Stanford University that requires donations from listeners like you to continue its diverse programming. Please consider making a donation by emailing us at donate@kzsu.stanford.edu. All right, let's dive in here, Jeff. You know, I got the book. I saw, you know, it was over 300 pages. I am, you know, I'm a very interested reader, and I get into the book, and immediately, you know, I'm confronted with a narrative where there are names and teams and groups, and you know, it reminded me. I'm going to use another analogy, but this is going to sound negative, but I really did enjoy the book. But it reminded me of like the movie Dune, you know, which was criticized for having too many characters, so the movie didn't do well. And I don't now. I would love to see a movie out of this, and if you've seconded those rights, congratulations. But let me start right there. The reader coming into this book has to be prepared for a narrative where, even, and I was reading closely, and I still had to try to and you don't have to remember all the details. I had to remember, okay, oh yeah, there's this team and that team, and this person's talking. So I want to start right there. and I'm asking about the craft as a reporter, okay? And I teach law too, and this is what we do. We try to figure out a story. How do you keep track of this? How did you keep track of it? You had to have not just copious notes, but I'm imagining that it's almost like a gigantic fill in the blank and you're trying to weave a story. So give us the backstory on how you put all of this together to keep it straight, where critics of the book said, well, there might be occasional inconsistencies, which I would call it, and they did say it, but they're minor, right? An amazing triumph given all the story here. How does that happen? How does
Yeah, well, in terms of the Dune analogy, if it does as well as Dune, I'll be
yeah,
just
yeah,
fine with
yeah,
it.
fair enough. Yeah,
But um, I would say, look, like there's a couple ways to tell the story of Facebook. I think a lot of the books that have been written about it have focused on the founders of the company and, you know, their origin stories or sort of executive dynamics and things like that. Uh, in my interest, in my case, I actually didn't really find the executives as human beings to be all that interesting. I mean, I think their decisions and what they did are massively important, and I mean, come with a lot of implications. But like, I don't know that sort of uh, that Mark Zuckerberg is Steve Jobs or Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos or sort of has that level of dynamicism, I will say. Uh, and I think so. The telling the story here was, I think, a story was telling the story of what people discovered inside and their disillusionment. And I can't say it has a happy ending. This is a whole bunch of extremely bright people came to terms with the deficiencies of the platform and ways in which it could be better, ways in which the platform was sort of actively contributing to societal problems for the reason that this was good for the business, it was good for engagement. And So sort of that story kind of does appear over and over. Then there's also, I think you used the word Kremlinology at some point earlier when we were talking. There is also this like kind of crazy bureaucracy in which everyone is attempting to channel what Mark wants.
right.
And exactly what that looks like and when sort of Mark does, come down from above and weigh in on things is also a part of the story. But I mean, in the end, the goal here is to get beyond just like, oh my gosh, there's content controversies, Donald Trump, should he be kicked off the platform, etc., and talk about the way that the actual mechanics of Facebook um, basically without sort of like having an explicit bias in terms of politics or particular material, does incentivize certain forms of behavior and does fundamentally change how we talk to each other, what we consume, what content succeeds, what tactics publishers use in a way that again, its own employees regularly determined was a lot more scary than good frequently.
One of the threads that and there is so much here, which is a platitude often said by interviewers, but really is true. There's no way to even begin to kind of weave all the narratives in an interview, but I do want to weave some threads that come through. Um, one of the threads that comes through your story is that there are people who enter the narrative, which again starts about 2012, who have a particular charge within one of the teams operating at Facebook, wind up at least the way you describe it, wind up as initially as being idealistic, but certainly committed to the goal of that particular team, and then one piece of information or another arises, which causes that individual to think there's a problem here that needs to be solved. And it seemed that at most turns, while the problem was quote unquote solved, the solution itself wasn't really thought through. So one of the themes that comes through when I read the book, and I'm curious your reaction to it, is before we even get into misinformation, is that while Facebook is operating as businesses do with a goal of profits, Facebook is regularly in a reactive mode. It's not doing a lot of calling of what's going to happen, but it's doing a lot of, wait a minute, we need to react. Is that a fair read of what was going on there during this period?
This is true from on topics from teen mental health to genocide in Myanmar. It is the way the company operates, and a big part of that. I mean, there's two reasons for that. One is I think shall we say, an excessive trust in computers to be neutral and somehow, serve the will of users. And the second one is that the platform is just too damn fast. So I think, one of the problems that regularly emerges here is that in basically fine-tuning the platform for extreme virality, they created something that was pretty much impossible to oversee, that it could go within minutes from being, a random post containing a wildly inflammatory claim could go from 0 to global in minutes. And fact checking takes hours or days. And the company neither had the technology nor the manpower required to sort of keep that system in check. And I think a recurring problem in crises, whether it's the Easter bombing in Sri Lanka back in, I want to say, 2022, or sorry, 2020, or whether it is the Stop the Steal movement, is that by the time a human has even sort of comprehended what's happening, it's already too late, to do anything other than clean up. And there is a tremendous, I think, as you noted, Facebook is a business, and it does exist to, serve the interests of its owners. And I would say that they just had a very hard time diverting from sort of whatever was optimal engagement, the path of optimal engagement. They didn't even understand they were doing this originally, right? Like, it wasn't until 2019, the later half of 2019, that they realized that the regular work of the growth team was actually making their integrity and safety problems worse. I mean, this, in hindsight, shouldn't have been surprising, that if you're optimizing for growth above all else, you're probably optimizing for some bad behaviors. But they just weren't even watching for this stuff. So I think a big part of the question originally from leaders is just like, why do things keep going wrong on our platform as frequently as they do? Originally, the company itself, even at the top levels, didn't seem to understand this.
And yet, when as a business matter, again, we're recording on July 19th. Overnight, CrowdStrike, right? The security platform failed. And I would have been actually flying back to Greensboro from the West Coast today if I hadn't changed the flight. And Jeff, we would have had to reschedule this interview, which we've had to do before. I mean, literally, flight was canceled. One thing which also struck me is how much, at the end of the day, right, the business model that comes through, that one is crystal clear, right? It's not just profits, but it's also also, right, reliability of the platform itself. It's remarkable in light of the breadth of the platform, how really mundane things don't seem to be happening that much. There isn't a lot of reaction to the system crashed, although it happens from time to time. There isn't a lot of concern about data integrity, maybe because that isn't a big focus. It seemed like if the core mission is let's make money and let's have a reliable, I mean, technologically reliable platform, Facebook's wildly successful.
The reliability, if we're talking about time up, yes,
Yeah,
it's
that's what
pretty
I mean.
rare
That's
that
what I mean.
things go south on that one. Although there was that incident actually right when before Francis Haugen went public, in which I believe they had to break into their own data center with an angle grinder
Uh-huh. Yeah,
because
yeah,
they
yeah,
basically
that,
managed to unplug themselves from the internet.
right.
But setting that aside,
Putting that one aside. Yeah,
I will say that uh, things actually do break all the time, right? The move fast and break things system very much applies to the product itself. Like the number of site events, aka disasters. There are frequently several going on at once, and uh, you know data pipelines break on a regular basis, like key systems go south. I mean, this is just an example from the book. Uh, in the month and a half before the Stop the Steal movement resulted in January 6th, there was a mistake in which a data pipeline went down, and therefore 8 billion views of bad content, like content that people should have been getting suppressed because it was problematic for a whole bunch of reasons worldwide. 8 billion views, whoops, that just happened. And so, things like that are just kind of all the time. And it does make sense, incidentally, that the way that if you think of social media, it's sort of as a sort of form of new communication, particularly with cell phones, uh, there was a land grab to be done, and Facebook won that. And it does make sense that introspection does not do very well with land grab dynamics, right? So, the company's entire approach to its product was simply, you know, uh, and particularly when it came to machine learning, right? It was like, oh, this tool is amazing. We can throw in 50 different variables into a model, and we can ask it to optimize for a particular thing, such as, say, likes or time spent or whatever, and the machine will just do it for us.
right.
And every once in a while, someone will be like, "Well, how is the machine doing it for us, and what are the ramifications for conversation on the platform, and which publishers are succeeding, and so forth?" And I think those were generally treated as loser questions, which is a little unfortunate because they're pretty important. I mean, the faith in just sort of the ability of blind optimization for metrics was so great that, like, it literally took until the second half of 2020 for the company to start on a daily basis paying attention to the top items of content on the platform, like just looking at the leaderboard to see what was succeeding and maybe try to reverse engineer why. And this is something that, like, from the point of view of media, just seems insane that you would not be paying attention to the most successful items, good or bad, right? But I think the philosophy really was, we're just going to let the platform work it out, and the more time people spend, clearly the more valuable the product is to them. So as long as we're maximizing that.
Well, and I'll tell you, it's something that struck me as well, and I'm curious about it because at one level, I don't want to push back a little. At one level, it is crazy. On the other hand, right, the old saying, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? If the goal is making money and people are, putting their eyeballs on it and clicking like and engaging more and more, we win. I mean, I was reminded, and my own personal experience when I was in practice, I worked for a few clients who got caught up in the Enron failure, which if listeners don't remember this was really the first of the major modern failures where Enron, giant conglomerate, more or less folded. And one of the big reason it folded is that no one could really understand how it was making money, including the people who are making money off of it.
But also some fraud.
And
Definitely,
well, I was about to say,
definitely some
yeah,
oil tankers
yeah, yeah.
that didn't exist off the coast of
Well,
Nigeria, but yeah.
yeah, no, I of course, I mean, one of the reasons, right? One of the big reasons. Yeah, there are a couple other things going on, but in terms of the interaction that people, that investors and others had with it, at least in my experience, a lot of it was, we're making money, so who's why ask why, and that seems to be a lot of what is going on in this space, and the reason I come to that. Well, I'll pose it as a question. I mean, do you think that's a fair statement? In other words, it's not all that crazy to not ask questions in light of a business model that says, let's make as much money as quickly as possible.
Yeah, and who gives a damn about the
Yes.
externalities?
Right.
That
Right.
last
No,
part gets said a
that's
little
right. Yes.
quietly,
Yeah. Exactly.
but yeah, I think look, I think one of the reasons why Facebook, now Meta, had the problems it did with its employees on this front is that that wasn't what they sold employees. It really came in with this aura of like sort of techno idealism. I mean, Mark Zuckerberg literally was claiming that um, Facebook and social media would end terrorism in the Middle East and elsewhere because once sort of everyone was connected, it would be impossible to hate each other because you'd somehow this was more than a little naive and obviously didn't quite work. And I think there was this sense though of an original mission, and that the company really was did see itself as um, bringing the world together, and uh, I think it got really difficult for a lot of people internally to explain why that just simply was not happening. And in fact, that, if anything, that discourse on Facebook seemed more destructive than discourse elsewhere, right? Things like QAnon, which is like basically just that's a conspiracy that is I mean, we don't need to get into all the details. I'm sure everyone mostly knows it anyway, but it is a half skip from a call to outright violence based on the idea of a pedophilic democratic cabal running the world, also with some Jews thrown in. And you always got to have some Jews
Of
thrown in. It's
course. Of
important.
course.
But the like it was just like, why is our platform the incubator for this? And I mean, it turns out there were very good reasons why. The design of the platform, both in terms of the recommendation systems and in terms of the feature sets, like there were extents for years. There was a debate where the safety staff was pleading basically for caps on how many people you could invite into a group. This isn't a bad algorithm question. This is just a basic feature question. How many per day is reasonable? Uh, is it thousands? Because that's what they chose. And that allows literally a single user in the span of 6 months invited 400,000 people into QAnon groups. One person did that. Now that's like a remarkable microphone for that you can't really find anywhere else. Likewise, how many people is good to friend per day? This is like a question that I think where Facebook kind of the blindness they showed to some qualitative measures here gets pretty obvious. Um, like, how many people do you think it makes sense to friend per day on a base, on a basis? Like, if you're being really sociable on the internet, half dozen, I don't know, people that you're going to meet, connect with. Maybe if you've just gotten online for the first time, there's a big glut of people you're going to find. Uh, Turns out, though, that around 2019, someone on Facebook's friending team, their goal is to increase the number of friend connections made, realized that half of their growth was coming from people who were sending more than 100 friend requests per day. Now, like, anyone who hears that outside of Facebook is going to think, oh, hell, those are scammers. That's fraud, scammers, manipulation. Nobody on a regular basis is sending out 100 friend requests a day. This isn't meaningful social interaction. This is spam and scam.
Right.
And at Facebook, though, they actually revolted against that thinking. Like internally, there were these discussions of like, well, maybe people in the global South have different concepts of friendship. And you're like, guys, no, no, like you're literally polluting your own platform here. And so they had just kind of this, I think it was really hard for them to think that any usage of Facebook should ever be limited, that there should be any restraints. Like friction was a bad word. It was a thing to be eliminated under all circumstances. And so, yeah, on a business basis, this was working out great. And targeted advertising is extremely powerful. If you were able to create more ad inventory via more slots between content and more time on platform, you made more money. But there just was I think, uh, not looking under the hood almost became a point of pride, if that makes sense.
No, and it comes through, and we're chatting with Jeff Horwitz, author of the book Broken Code on KZSU-FM Stanford. One other point before we talk a little bit about where we're headed here, Jeff, is the again I'm using this analogy, but it's apt. These various teams, of which you're not even, I think, reporting on all of them, but it's dozens, right? One team that stands out through most of the narrative is a team that seemed to change names occasionally, but more or less was called Civic Integrity. And as you already alluded to, right, the Facebook starts off with a robust, idealistic, perhaps utopian view of what that is, but the Civics Integrity team seems to basically run up against and run opposed to virtually every other team operating inside the business. Help my listeners a little bit, and again, the book gets into this, right? The role of the civic integrity team, and how these teams were constantly, at war, or at least working at cross purposes.
Yeah, I think calling it a war is perhaps overstating
Fair enough.
no, overstating the evenness of the
Oh,
side.
fair.
It was generally, I would call it more a slaughter in most instances.
Mhm.
But
Yeah.
uh, the Civic's an interesting case study in sort of disillusionment, right? Like all of this team got originally hired not to deal with problems, but to figure out how Facebook could make democracy even better, right? So they were like working on town halls and constituent badges and like particular like ways that Facebook could further enrich democracy. Then comes the 2016 election, and I'll credit here to Craig Silverman, then of BuzzFeed. Craig uh, noted that false news had basically overtaken real news on the platform in the final weeks of the 2016 election. And to the company's surprise, this turned out to be true. Like they had not realized themselves, they weren't paying attention. And from there sort of starts the introspection work of like, okay, well, like, why are Macedonian teenagers pumping out false stories about Hillary Clinton's health? Why are they like outperforming the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal? What the hell's going on? And I think there is a sense like that this is basically a team that's pretty heavily involved in discovering how the platform is getting gamed. And uh, civic. So we basically could go from civic to civic integrity, which is basically playing defense. This is a team that is trying to basically figure out how do you address misinformation. And the problem is that every single thing. This goes back to what we were saying earlier, that the platform was optimized for growth at the expense of safety issues. It turns out that making resharing easier and recommending content from people that they don't follow, both those things inherently boost the percentage of misinformation people consume. They're not asking for it, but basically it turns out that the fake stuff is more exciting. It gets more engagement, even if that engagement sometimes is just people saying, no way, this is trash. that's still a positive thing. I think also, I mean, so problem that Civic had regularly is that they were noting that their colleagues were designing a system that was all gas and no brakes, in the sense that there are all of these like little minor triggers that Facebook uses to determine whether a piece of content should be further amplified. You know, not just the like, but emoji, a comment, reshare, whether or not a user sort of pauses their cursor over it. You know, there's any number of different sort of positive, you know, yes, ramp this up more signals. Dislike, there is no dislike button. And they intentionally built this thing basically to only amplify, not to ever slow down. This had, I think, fairly predictable consequences. And so the Civic team ends up regularly being asked to take the other side of the argument from growth. And I mean, growth in terms of resources, in terms of economic incentives, in terms of leadership background. Growth is the heart of Facebook. And so it was never a fair fight. Civic ended up basically being, they couldn't do away with this stuff, because it turns out if you completely did away with it, the platform just went off the rails. But actually embracing it would have hurt the company. And I think this is something that, like, again, the metrics at Facebook, they tell the true story. If I told you that, you know, Facebook would never sacrifice 0.1% of its usage for any benefit to society whatsoever, that might sound hyperbolic. Unfortunately, that is actually laid out in their documents, that quote unquote DAP, daily average people, is quote unquote sacred. And any change to the platform that would reduce it is DOA. That is like stated flat out internally. And I mean, you can see this in other instances too. That wasn't just internal hyperbole. You know, in the weeks before Myanmar's final election in 2020, that at least the last one they're going to be having for a while, due to the coup, you know, there were they put into place what were called break the glass measures. Some of these things reduced misinformation by 25%, photo-based misinformation, which is even bigger in a society with literacy issues, by 50%, simply by sort of slowing down reshares. It reduced, and only in Myanmar, reduced usage by, like, I want to say 0.2% of engagement. So it's a more complex stat. And so, like, here was this trade-off, right? You could take this vast hunk out of misinformation in a place that had literally undergone a genocide fueled by social media, and your own platform. You could reduce that substantially, but it was going to come with this tiny hit to usage in a place that is like worth zero money in terms of advertising dollars. And they were only willing to do that for a month around the election. After that, it had to go, because there was, like, this was an ideology, right? That any departure from sort of the maximal usage, maximal engagement was a failing. And so that was kind of the world the Civic team lived in, right? Is that they were always fighting, they were always kind of in retreat and fighting a rearguard action, trying to sort of prevent the worst possible outcomes, while, you know, the best ways to fix the platform were blocked to them, because the best ways to fix the platform were a departure from the optimal growth curve.
The story that you tell, you know, Jeff, I mean, there's so much here, but I think the one example that stood out with me, you know, you wrote, while the company's hate classifiers had been good enough to detect the problem, they weren't reliable enough to automatically remove the torrent of hate. And I think that kind of sums up what we're dealing with here. You know, I'm curious, you know, as we close in a couple of minutes, were there any blind spots that you had as you were writing the story? In other words, you know, you certainly present a compelling narrative based upon evidence of what Facebook has done. Is there anything that you know, when you look at the reporting that you know, obviously we could wish we could know lots of things, but do you feel like you had any blind spots that prevented you from reaching conclusions?
I mean, I think, look, it always would be great to have more scenes in which leadership argues and bickers among themselves. But there really was no question what was actually coming down, like what was happening in the guts of the operation. And I think that's what I kind of wanted to understand was, not what does Mark Zuckerberg think about so and so, but how does this platform actually shape behavior? And like this is the lovely thing about Facebook's internal research. They ran A/B tests. You could see. Um, you can't say, and I think this is something that happens with a lot of the social science research. You can't say that Facebook conclusively caused this, genocide or this outbreak of violence, that they
Or
were
this election.
responsible for this candidate's election. But what you can demonstrate very, very clearly internally is that a particular feature change would either increase or decrease certain behaviors. And some of those behaviors are really awful. And on the platform, right? Not off the platform. Connecting it to off platform is very hard. And I mean, it's kind of like the question of like, okay, well, tell me what effect television had on, teen mental health. Good luck with that, right? And the answer is it depends how you use it. There's a whole bunch of resources, and like literally, like many decades after the fact, we still can't answer that question in like a good or bad way. I think with Facebook, a big part of the story was that the company really talked up its technical wizardry. You mentioned the hate speech issue. This was a shock because, we'd been all fed a line about how AI was going to, really solve content moderation issues, was seeing written in black and white that the platform's classifiers were only good enough to remove 3 to 5%. And by the way, that hasn't changed much. There's more of a gray area stuff where they're like, this is probably hate speech, but we're not sure, where it can suppress it a little bit. But like, this was the sort of like, we're going to have a perfect, safe platform where advertisers can, can reach people next to good content and contribute to society because of our technical prowess. That was close to a lie. The capacities weren't ever there. And, it was kind of more of a like, we'll just deal with, AI will take care of it. Turns out to be a form of optimism bordering on lying, I think. And it started out as optimism. It got closer toward being lying. I'll put it that way.
Or wishful thinking. And we're closing now, but coming into weekend, by the time the show airs, we might have a different Democratic candidate, or at least not have the current candidate for president on the Democratic side, and so it's going to be
no position on this. No position on this.
Oh, no, I'm not asking that. I'm not asking that. That's a different interview. Jeff Horwitz, author of the book Broken Code: Inside Facebook and the Fight to Expose Its Harmful Secrets. Thank you for joining us on Hearsay Culture, discussing your craft, discussing your book, and for taking the time today.
Thanks much. Take care.
The Hearsay Culture Network is available at hearsayculture.com. You can get all previous KZSU shows, as well as my show with my co-host Denise Howell, R&D with D&D, and Denise's show Uneven Distribution. KZSU airs Hearsay Culture at noon on Sundays, excuse me. And so please listen in. Meanwhile, please stay tuned for KZSU for more diverse programming, and have a great day.